We live in a society where there is intense political polarization. Often this polarization results in deeply emotional interactions and deep philosophical disagreements. Two terms that surface very often in this conversation are oppression and privilege. Let's compare the lives of two people. The first person is born into a high socioeconomic status, while the second person is born into a family who is experiencing poverty. The first person didn't do anything to earn their higher socioeconomic status and the advantages that come along with that wealth, but they enjoy these advantages nonetheless. This is what many philosophers call a privilege. When these advantages are experienced across a social group, it is often referred to as oppression. However, many people dismiss these terms as buzzwords or do not fully understand what each term means. Furthermore, many people in our society today do not even believe that oppression and privilege exist. This week on Crash Course Philosophy, we're talking about oppression and privilege. So you realize you've got privilege, and your next question is, well, what do I do? Fortunately, a philosophical understanding of the terms oppression and privilege can help us figure out what we're supposed to do in our response to privilege. Dr. Allison Bailey is a professor of philosophy and women and gender studies at Illinois State University and has done lots of philosophical research about privilege. She makes a core distinction between privilege and advantage. This distinction between privileges and advantages are very important. She says that all privilege is advantageous, but not all advantages count as privilege. While important, this definition can be very confusing. If you've realized that you have these unearned advantages, you can just avoid them, right? Well, it's not that simple. There isn't exactly a clear distinction between your unearned advantages, privilege, and the ones that you've actually earned. Suppose that you have the unearned advantage of a higher socioeconomic status than someone else that you were born into. This higher socioeconomic status could have caused you to get a better education, both by either living in better areas with better schools, or going to a private school, or just by having more support and more resources available to you to help you get into a school of higher education. The reason you can't just avoid your unearned privileges here is because they're all interwoven with your earned advantages. While you definitely did do a significant amount of work in order to get into a good college, another person might have had to work harder to do it because they didn't have the same unearned advantage. Your privilege helped you get into the school even though you did a significant amount of work yourself. This seems to imply if you had a privilege that helped you earn this advantage of getting into a good college, you didn't fully earn it yourself, or maybe others had to work harder to earn it. You can see how privilege makes it complicated in determining whether or not you have actually earned something. The privilege helped you earn it. So okay, you've established that you haven't done all the work to fully earn everything that you believe that you've earned. Should you give it all up? These are the philosophical questions that result from this important conversation. But for now, let's hold on the response. If there is an advantage, by nature there must also be a disadvantage. And because that disadvantage is being called oppression, then there must also be oppressors, right? Well, not necessarily. Marilyn Frye uses the example of a birdcage to try to explain oppression. For her, oppression is the combination of all the various institutions that provide barriers to a certain social group. Consider a birdcage, she says. If you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by this myopic focus, you could look at that one wire up and down the length of it, be unable to see why a bird could not just fly around the wire at any time if it wanted to go somewhere else. Furthermore, even if, one day at a time, you myopically inspected each wire, you can still not see why a bird would have trouble going past the wires or get anywhere. There's no physical property of any one wire. Nothing that the closest scrutiny could discover that would reveal how a bird could be inhibited or harmed except by the most accidental way. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that you can see why a bird does not go anywhere. And then you will see it in a moment. So while there may be some people who are actively oppressing people, the birdcage analogy seems to imply that it's much more of an institutional and systematic structure that is oppressing, rather than specific people. In other words, if you have privilege, it probably doesn't mean you're an oppressor. So what do we do? We have this definition of oppression and this definition of privilege, so we have a better understanding of them now. But does that really help us understand what our response to privilege should be? Well, the short answer is yes, it should. It ultimately depends on the individual's conception of the good and conception of justice to determine what that definition means for our response. For some people, the recognition that they have an unearned advantage means that they should give it up, because for them, all unearned advantage is unjustified. However, for some people, an unearned advantage could be justified. Suppose that a parent gives a gift to a child. Of course, that gift that they've been given is an unearned advantage, but is that really oppressing anyone else? Some people would say yes, and some would say no. So ultimately, it really does determine on your conception of the good and justice. So regardless of what that conception of justice is, you should still use these definitions to inform what your response to privilege is. Today on Crash Course Philosophy, we examined oppression, privilege, and their philosophical definitions. I hope this episode has caused you to ask the important philosophical questions that privilege and oppression cause us to think about. What are my privileges? How have I benefited from unearned advantages? How can I use my privilege to benefit others? How can I fight oppression in my daily life? Should I change my daily life in order to fight oppression better? And if so, how should I do that? What birdcage wires am I refusing to see? What are the wires that are connected together that I'm not looking at macroscopically? Where is oppression happening in my daily life around me? Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Crash Course Philosophy.